Hello and welcome everyone to the third day of the Georgetown Global Dialogues. I'm hoping the third day will be as stimulating, if not more, than the previous 2 days. Jose Casanova, who's present here, remarked yesterday on how Tocqueville, probably one of the most far-sighted intellectual thinker ever, predicted with a brilliance that is still startling how the idea of equality is going to be truly revolutionary, truly irreversible. And today we can confirm in our collective lives, in our political lives, wherever we are, in whatever part of the world, the truth of that observation, of that insight. So even if the basic impulse towards equality has been corrupted, it's been debased, it's been hijacked by various authoritarian movements, it's been incarnated in horrifically brutal states, but nevertheless the energy behind that impulse remains undiminished. Billions and billions of people are still working towards some kind of political, social transformation around that idea of equality. But the one thing that Jose pointed out, Tocqueville did not see, could not anticipate, maybe because he was a man and he was a 19th century man, he could not see how the idea of gender equality would be equally revolutionary, how the impulses behind it would also become truly universal, breaking out in one country after another. Of course, also, as we can see today, provoking terrible backlashes, and I think we can all attest from our different geographic locations around the world how that backlash is damaging our political lives today. Feminism, in most of our conventional accounts of it, is identified or even simply assumed to be a value originating in Western Europe and the United States, so identified as a Western ideal, as a Western value. And certainly the conventional histories of feminism have tended to be centered in the Western experience. But of course, we know that multiple and very complex feminist movements have long existed across Asia, Africa, Latin America. And these have continually interacted with other struggles. In fact, they're in many cases inseparable from other struggles against injustice and hierarchy. And, on their outcomes today depend many other social and political outcomes. So today we have with us three very distinguished writers and thinkers who are going to illuminate this broader landscape. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Szalai, Veronica Gago, and Nasreen Malik to the stage.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Pankaj, and thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you to Georgetown for hosting this wonderful series of dialogues. Before I get into it, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Veronica Gago comes to us from Argentina, where she is a professor of social sciences at the University of Buenos Aires and the National University at San Martin. She is also a prominent political theorist and activist working on issues of feminism and the global political economy. Her most recent books include A Feminist Reading of Debt, which is co-written with Lucy Caballero, Feminist International, and Neoliberalism from Below. She is also a leader in Argentina's Ni Una Menos, not one woman less movement, as both a theorist and an activist. Nesrine Malik is an acclaimed British Sudanese author and journalist known for her wide-ranging commentary on issues of race, identity politics, and international affairs. She is the author of We Need News Stories, challenging the toxic myths behind our age of discontent, and has published columns in leading outlets, including The Guardian, The New York Times, and The Washington Post, that address topics ranging from Islamophobia and feminism to African politics, with deep insights into the ways colonial and post-colonial legacies shape our contemporary world. Nesrine received the 2021 Robert B. Silvers Prize for Journalism. I'd also like to talk just a little bit about logistics. At the end of this discussion, we'll be talking for about an hour on stage, and the last 30 minutes will be reserved for questions from the audience. There are note cards, from what I understand, where you can write your questions and you can pass them down to the end of the aisle where they will be collected and passed up to me. So, to put it simply, we're here to talk about the global future of feminism. And, Pankaj touched, I think, on this interesting question, because when I look at the Western context, and perhaps especially the North American context, which is the one that I'm most intimately familiar with, the discussion can get pretty parochial pretty quickly. And, I remember it was maybe barely a decade ago that the mainstream discussion, here at least, seemed to be dominated by the question of whether women can have it all, how much to lean in. There was a very sort of specific kind of feminism, I think, that was directed towards women of the professional managerial class or aspirations. And then, it's strange to think of that now, because I think as we look at what's happening, not just here, but across the world, those conversations seem like they took place in another era, which they essentially did. And so since then, in the US, we had the Women's March in DC after the election of Donald Trump in 2016, the reckonings of Me Too, and now with the overturning of Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court in 2022, the conversation about feminism, a lot of it that I've seen at least, revolves very specifically around the issue of reproductive rights, which is of course connected to all kinds of other rights, social and economic rights. But I would say, so there is this fixation that, as I noted, can be quite parochial, but yet when Western feminism has deigned to take into account what happens elsewhere, it can come across, I think, as somewhat self-congratulatory sometimes, or worse, complicit in universalist crusades telling other countries and cultures what to do. And so to start off, actually, I wanted to ask Nesrine, who's written very incisively about this dynamic, and there was a line in your book that I keep remembering, which is, it is easier to acknowledge toxicity in a culture that isn't our own. So I was wondering if you could tell us how you think about that idea and how living in different parts of the world has shaped your own perspective on global gender inequality.
Thank you, and thank you for a great introduction and summary, and thank you all for being here. This is a session that's particularly close to my heart. As someone, as Jennifer said, who grew up in a certain feminist or non-feminist, or lack thereof, context. I grew up in North Africa and the Middle East. There was a certain strong feminist legacy that I grew up with, but also very intense challenges to women's rights in the region. And it was interesting that when I moved to the north or the west, the global north or the west, to see how those challenges were similar across the board, but just called different things. The most striking thing was the attitude towards violence against women, which is obviously the sharpest end of the spectrum when it comes to women's rights and kind of feminist challenges. So I grew up with you referred to this in your introduction, the kind of universalist condemnation or superiority that comes across when Western feminist values are imposed upon other contexts. So I grew up with this shame about honor killings. It was a very intense, very kind of central stigma to growing up in the Muslim world. And I didn't quite recognize it in my own life. I mean, I saw violence and I saw intimidation and I saw all sorts of difficult dynamics between men and women, but the concept of honor killings seems to be something that was defined and imposed by other people. They weren't called honor killings in Arabic. They were actually not called anything at all. And then when you kind of look at the language or the framing of violence in countries that are not considered other or not considered naturally predisposed to violence, they're called very gentle, very scientific things. So 34% of American women who are murdered of all women, American who are murdered, 34% are killed by what is called an intimate partner. Now, it's a horrible crime, but intimate partner sounds far more negotiable as a problem than honor killings. Another 16% are murdered by non-intimate partners that tend to be also men, so parents, grandparents, siblings. These are staggering numbers. So over, 34 are killed by a spouse, an ex-boyfriend, a current boyfriend. These numbers, if you applied them to the entirety of the Middle East, would actually seem very large, even compared to a region of that scale. So if you take it from Morocco to Jordan, the numbers, obviously there's kind of reporting challenges, but we are talking maybe 10, 15 women a year in the areas where honor killings are considered most prevalent, which is mostly in Jordan and the kind of near Middle East. The other thing that I found quite interesting is the way abusive relationships are framed. There's been a recent categorization of abusive relationships to encompass something called coercive control, which is ways in which men control women where there is no physical violence. That is also an interesting categorization of a dynamic that makes it seem like a kind of psychological or mental state that we can negotiate as well. We can kind of talk men out of this state of coercion, this state of capture by desires to control women. In the Middle East, North Africa, it's just basically abusive men, violent men, brown/Muslim men who want to subjugate women, cover them up, and hide them away. So the experience of kind of living in two contexts where violence is categorized or abuse is categorized very differently has made me realize that when it's happening to us, when it's happening in your own culture, this is also similar to how I grew up. It was something that we did not think was that problematic, right? It was something that we thought was a kind of extension of family dynamics, right? A sort of skirmish or a sort of unfortunate accident that happens when there is violence or when there is abuse. And it's something that is incumbent upon the women to negotiate. The same thing happens in other contexts where it's considered not something elemental and foundational and at the heart of our values, right? So the way we discuss certain aspects of how women are treated, like I mentioned earlier, are finessed in a way so that we talk about them at a huge distance from what defines who we are, what our values are, what we believe in, what we teach our children, and how we sort of create our social and cultural values. It is completely remote from that. The assumption is that our values are sound, and these are just kind of challenging phenomena of violence, like gun violence, that we need to legislate around and discuss. But it's not something that ever triggers a serious, earnest reflection into how sophisticated, how developed our social values are and our cultural approaches are to gender and broadly all issues of minority equality.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. And, bringing up the issue of violence, what we call it, I was also interested in reading your work, Veronica, because you write a lot, understandably, about the issue of femicide and its connection to the Ni Una Menos movement. And so I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit briefly about how that movement started, what it was in reaction to, and how it's changed and grown since then.
Yes, thank you very much, Pankaj, for the introduction, and you, Jennifer, and thank you for being here. Yes, the Ni Una Menos movement started in 2015 as a reaction, a collective reaction against femicide. But I think that it was interesting that a sort of catalyst of a deeper movement against violence. And when I'm thinking in Argentina and also how I grew up with different references of struggle against violence, I think that the main reference in our country is the group of mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, the mothers and grandmothers who search for their disappeared sons and daughters, and also for the sons and daughters of those disappeared people, because the children were kidnapped by the dictatorship. So in the middle of the dictatorship, they started to organize different kind of protests. They organized a sort of public mourning, but also they politicize very profoundly, in a very crucial way, the political space, the public space. So I think this is a powerful image that, of course, they were not feminist in the traditional sense, and they in that moment did not name themselves as feminists, but their practice was and is very feminist in the sense of doing something with that pain, put it collectively, and they said they took them alive, we want them alive. So I think this is a slogan very powerful to think also how the feminist movement reshaped it. And we say nowadays, not one less, we want ourselves free, alive, and without death. So there is a connection between different issues that is economical, political, and also vital in that sense of freedom. So I think what is interesting to think in the feminist movement in Argentina is that it's built upon different genealogies, different political genealogies, that at the first glance, maybe they are not pure feminist genealogies. They are movement of human rights, movement of women, or also different demands of indigenous people for the land and against violence against them and their lands. And I think that this kind of mixture of genealogies, this kind of mixture of political praxis, produce a different kind of movement when we talk in Argentina about a feminist movement. It's very much connected with other struggles and very much connected with a protagonism of women, for example, that were very important in the 2001 crisis. The unemployed women who took the streets, who occupied factories, who organized soup kitchens against the poverty of the situation. So I think that all that kind of experience, different layouts of political experience, where the protagonism, the social protagonism, was highly feminized, but maybe in the last year we call that feminism. And before this movement, we talk about, different experiences of women in the public space or different struggles where the women were protagonists, but maybe not with the level of feminism. And I think what is interesting in the last years, in 2015, 2016 to now, is that possibility to reframe, also rethink, at the point that nowadays, for example, mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, they say, now we realize that we have been always feminist.
Oh, okay.
But nowadays, we can think in that terms our own experience. And I think this is something that is happening, for example, with the political activists who were in exile. And recently, they started to think collectively together the experience of rape in concentration camp and specific situation and experience of violence. And they say, before that, we were just in prison, militant activists, we suffered the same political violence that everyone, but we never think together and we never elaborate the specific sexual violence in concentration camps. And I think that is interesting how this very popular, grassrooted feminist movement enables different experiences to rethink, to reframe, but also to rename those genealogies. And of course, the main slogan and the beginning in 2015 of the Ni Una Menos movement was femicide. But what I think that is more interesting is how the becoming of the movement means a sort of complexification of the movement and a will to connect with very different struggles. For example, housing struggles, land struggles, food struggles, of course, diversity struggles. Our movement is a trans-feminist movement. And sexual workers, and also another important component of the feminist movement in Argentina is the unions, the women that are part of the unions as workers, and they are also given different battles in their own organizations as workers. So the composition of the feminist movement in Argentina is very embedded in this kind of genealogies, but also in different popular organizations and different social movements that have already existed before the Ni Una Menos. So it is a kind of very grounded feminist in different experiences, but at the same time with the capacity to reorganize those experiences.
Right. And Veronica, you bring up something that I'm very curious about when looking at the Argentine context, which is you have all this coalition building, real grassroots coalition building among, these causes that are all connected but seem maybe disparate on the surface. And so I think it's sort of fascinating to think about, because I feel like there is an assumption, a commonly held assumption, that in order to build a popular movement, you have to compromise, you have to moderate your demands, and you have to tack toward the center. And from what you're telling us, in fact, in Argentina, it's the opposite case. And I know you've talked about the movement's massiveness and how it's connected to radicality. And I was just curious, was that something that was apparent from the very beginning to you, or was it something that just sort of built on itself?
No, I feel that it was a sort of build on and a sort of scale up of the movement. But when I was writing my book, these two features of radicality and massiveness going together, I think that it was a very important clue to understand the novelty of the movement. And I think that, as you were saying, all the time they say, well, if you want to be massive, you have to moderate your speech, and you have to try to be more cautious, because the audience maybe is afraid of some words or some concepts. And I think the experience in Argentina is the opposite. Because, for example, when we started to organize also the connection between housing struggles and abortion rights struggles, with the idea of, payment gap for workers, that is the way that feminism started to make sense for a lot of different people that maybe never feel interested in the feminist agenda. We hate that word, agenda. But it is a way to put it briefly, to say, well, how we can expand the notion of feminism, not as an intellectual operation, that we have to have that and that, and as a political coalition, as you were saying, and with a lot of political work that kind of practice demands. So I think what is interesting is that nowadays feminism is a sort of common sense in a lot of different places that maybe 5 or 8 years ago you never heard the word feminism.
Right.
And a lot of people in the movement said, well, that is what we are learning how to do, how to re-narrate our own experience. And I think this is the creative part of feminism, because you are inventing what is feminism. And I think that is more radical in the terms that is more inclusive, in terms of very different experiences, very different expectations. And I think this is the only way to produce this massiveness.
Right. And connected to this, and actually this is a question for both of you, I think, again, as I said, the Western context is the one that I know most intimately. There is a strain of Western feminism that defines freedom or emancipation in terms of individual choice, freedom from group oppression, essentially. But then there's another strain, and it's present here, but I especially hear it or see it in my mind's eye when you talk about what's happening in Argentina, that defines emancipation differently in terms of solidarity, interdependence as the emphasis points. And so I'm wondering if these approaches, do they contradict each other? Can they work together? I mean, is individual choice feminism, is that something that comes up in in the things that you think about?
So this actually opens up quite a big part of the contradiction at the heart of choice versus solidarity, and also choice under a system that allows you choice, and solidarity under a system that does not allow you choice. Where there is a system that allows individual autonomy, there tends to be an overemphasis on the individual choice as the kind of channel for feminism. In societies where there is not so much of that space, there is much more of that group solidarity. So if you sort of think of what is conjured up in your mind when you think of Sudanese women, African women, Egyptian women, Saudi women, it's all very flat. It's a sort of group of women who are either behind a burqa, in a hijab, or in a sort of, or swathed by some cloth, and they are done to, as opposed to agents of change themselves. These are, even when they are in states where they have no individual choice and no means of huge group solidarity across kind of a large territory, even the small spaces in which they exist are very vital spaces. They're very dynamic spaces. There are spaces in which there is comfort, there is recognition of other people's suffering, there is economic support, there's spontaneous mutual aid between women. And so even in that state where individual choice is completely denied, that does not mean it is airless, and it does not mean that it does not create small nodes of solidarity that could become an interconnected web once the conditions are favorable. On the other hand, and this is something I'm quite keen to address to the sort of female students in the audience, which is in a society where there is a lot of individual choice, a lot of individual autonomy, and where your ability to dress how you like, to get an education at an elite institution, to become employed, to travel, to not require the guardianship or the sponsorship of a male or a kind of elder in general, this might seem like the sort of ceiling. This is the dream. This is basically what mimics, and the dream is what mimics the rights that men have. But in ways that are systemic, that individual choice does not accumulate and amount to a lever that you can pull that will create the kind of systemic change that you require. How many women are there on the US Supreme Court?
Let me count.
2, 3?
There's
Three.
Yeah.
So these elite 4, someone said 4.
Kagan, Sotomayor, Amy Coney Barrett, and Ketanji Brown.
There you go. 4 women on the US Supreme Court.
Exactly.
These elite spaces have been opened up for women, and not elite spaces only in terms of kind of the city or law or financial services, not even that kind of cold, bloodless aspect of representation. Within the legislature, women are represented. And what has happened in the past 10 years or so? There has been not only a backlash, but a cannibalizing of women's rights in the US. With reproductive rights being at the center of it. And that was just unfathomable 10 years ago. But you had this, I was very happy to see you name check this kind of boss girl feminism at the beginning of the conversation, because boss girl feminism was followed by an almighty wake-up call that you can become the CEO of Facebook, you can be in the Supreme Court, you can head up JP Morgan, you can have FTSE 500 or NASDAQ 100 companies led by women, and it will not have a jot of effect on something that is as intimate and important to you as your reproductive rights. So the kind of overall summary of this sort of individual rights versus solidarity model is that at the extreme ends of both, it is still a system that does not produce the required results for women, because the value system has not been addressed, which goes back to my original point, which is the further away we distance our language and our concerns and our fears from what we believe, what we teach ourselves, and how we perceive ourselves, then it will always occur in a space in which that has no effect on everyday life.
Mm-hmm. And I think you raised an interesting point, which is about this question of value system and how that changes. How does it change? I mean, I think for a long time there was this idea of sort of the trickle-down feminist notion, right? Where you have enough women in positions of power and they will make the world a more hospitable place for women, which hasn't necessarily happened. And so, yeah, I guess I'm just, I think about in the United States, I mean, we've never had a woman in the highest office. Mm-hmm. So I think, that's sort of become a focal point, or that has been a focal point for a lot of women, understandably, who would like to see somebody in that position. But whether or not that would actually make a difference to value system, I mean, how do both of you see this notion of things changing at that fundamental level?
Well, I think that the idea of a woman as a biological definition is not what we were discussing from the feminist movement. So, of course, I acknowledge that it's important that some figures, I am thinking, for example, in Marielle Franco in Brazil, who was assassinated, but she was a very important political figure. And nowadays, the vice president of Colombia, Francia Marquez. So their presence there is very important as a political message. But we are not talking about women. We are talking about black feminist anti-extractivist militants in that position of power. So I think this is very different when we think, well, what is our proposed to be there, in what sense, what is the popular and feminist mandate that one of our comrades could be there and develop a programmatic feminist policies and so on. So I think this is a very important analysis to go beyond this idea of or it's an individual decision or it's a collective and solidarity as a other logic of as other political logic. And I think that, for example, what happened in Argentina during the struggle for abortion law, it was very important because we discussed a lot the slogan, "My body, my decision." Which body?
Right.
Which decision? So we tried to dismantle the idea of individualism in that slogan, to think when we are discussing my body, we are discussing interdependence conditions. Mm-hmm. We are discussing the relationship with land, with social and economic rights. And when we are talking about my decision, it's not an individual choice. It's what are the conditions in which we can decide something. So the very interesting for me, Green Tide, it was the name in Argentina of the struggle for abortion rights, because a green scarf was the symbol. It was interesting that all the debate about rights also was, well, we are asking for a parliament, something, but at the same time, we know that it not depends only on the parliament. We need to be very active in the debate at schools, at families, and also at the universities and different neighborhoods, and produce a public conversation and a public debate about what abortion right means for us as a collective and political body. So I think this is very interesting how you can displace these very fixed terms.
Yes.
And what do you think that the situation here is nowadays?
You mean in terms of individual versus collective?
Yeah.
You know, I think, I mean, the United States is such a sort of interesting political context too, because it's very decentralized. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think, you know, with the overturning of Roe, I mean, to a certain extent, I think that was, you know, Nesreen, a real wake-up call for a lot of progressives, a lot of feminists who thought that that issue had been settled. I mean, it was 50 years on the books, or almost 50 years. And so I think that there is this question now of what happens. And you do see there are movements in the United States that I think are trying to sort of connect things more. I mean, I'm thinking of, there's a woman named Ai-jen Poo who heads up the National Domestic Workers Alliance and has been very involved in labor organizing of care work. Mm-hmm. And you know, most care workers are immigrant women or women of color. And so I think that there is that conversation taking place, and I think there's an attempt to sort of connect things, whether or not it sort of becomes the mass movement that you see in Argentina, I don't know. I mean, the political culture here, there's overlaps. I mean, you have a backlash there too.
Yes.
Yeah. So there are overlaps, but I'm not exactly sure what it would look like, because I mean, you know, the political culture here is very individualistic. I mean, there are certain things here, and I should say I'm originally from Canada, so I come, so a North American context, but slightly different. And you know, one of the things that shocked me, I remember when I first moved here more than 20 years ago, was the way that healthcare works. I mean, if you come from a place like Canada, I think the sort of system of privatized healthcare, which, you know, has changed with Obamacare, but not quite. I mean, it's, you know, coming from a place that has just sort of this presumption that, of course, it's a human right. You know, it's your right to have access to healthcare that's not going to completely destroy your family. And so I think it's an open question. I mean, I know a couple of years ago when Roe was overturned, there was a really, my colleague at the Times who's on the opinion page, Michelle Goldberg, wrote a very interesting column on, you know, feminism, what now? Yeah. And, you know, she is much more embedded and involved, not just as a journalist, but I think even, you know, more as a participant because she's a columnist, but, you know, really looking very closely at how the feminist movement has tried to handle what's happened. And, you know, she made the point that it took 50 years to undo Roe. You know, feminists now, I think, recognize that this is a matter for the long game. But what that looks like, I think we're still waiting to find out. And Veronica, you know, I wanted to talk a little bit about your research into, because you mentioned, you know, these structural forces that affect women specifically, or women, trans people, queer people, et cetera. And, you know, you've written a lot about the connection between financial exploitation and domestic labor, and you know, in particular, how debt works. And I was wondering if you could just explain that a little bit, because I feel like that's not necessarily intuitive to how people think about debt here.
Yes, it's like a double-level research because it's a political research and also a more traditional empirical research. And we started to analyze after Argentina came back to IMF in 2018 how the austerity politics that external debt imposed to our country translated into domestic or household indebtedness. And it was very shocking how especially women in charge of their homes started to get into debt to live, to buy food, to pay the rent, and to maybe buy very important things for the kids for the school. So it was for me very impressive also how these new kind of debts were linked to public programs of subsidy and welfare. So the connection between these welfare programs and banks and how this sort of capillarization of financial devices were at the same time a sort of help for women, for impoverished women in particular, and at the same time a way of financial exploitation of domestic work. So it is, for me, very interesting to analyze how maybe these women are not wage population because they didn't have in that moment a formal job, but at the same time they are a population for financial exploitation through that and exploiting especially domestic and care work. So it was interesting to discuss in different assemblies, on workshops and different meetings, well, how we can politicize that, how we can explain and make a sort of popular and feminist pedagogy about something that it seems so abstract as financial capital, but at the same time very concrete in everyday economies for different women and especially lesbian, trans, who are the most impoverished populations at least in Argentina. So we started to think different slogans, and we added, we want ourselves alive, free, and debt-free, because economic dependency is a root cause of violence. So we have to analyze not only the payment gap in salaries, for example, but going beyond and trying to analyze what is other economic violence, and specifically financial violence, that attacks directly the most impoverished women. Not only the most impoverished, but especially the most impoverished. So we did a lot of political work trying to think, well, how we can expand this collective comprehension. How can we produce a popular pedagogy to talk about these things in a very concrete manner? Because, you know, a lot of different global programs of financial inclusion, the so-called financial inclusion.
Microcredit?
Microcredit, but also after the pandemic, they had an explosion of financial inclusion. And all them start with the idea of the women are illiterate,
Yes.
financial illiterate. So we have to train them how to use finance, and the opposite is true, because all women are very well trained in doing a lot of magic things with money, with debt to survive, but also to produce community networks, but also to produce infrastructure of care in very dramatic situations. So we try to confront this idea of, well, we have to train them, we have to include them in a financial system, and trying to produce another kind of narrative, but also another idea of how we can strike debt. And I think it was very important in Argentina, this political line of action, because enables us also to think who owes to whom, and also the historical debts, and also the debt as a device that is at the same time micropolitical and macropolitical, and how we can translate into a street movement this very abstract idea of a struggle against debt.
And so was it conceived of as pedagogy first and then action? Is the movement at the pedagogy stage where women are learning, you know, about the connection between financial exploitation and their own debt situation? Or have there been actual demands? Have you decided on actual demands to make?
I think both, okay. Because we produce different spaces for political analysis about what is debt, in what sense it is related to this, mental health suffering also, and how it is related to welfare programs, but they are so poor that you have to complete the welfare programs with debt. So at the end of the day, the welfare programs started to be a sort of direct connection with banks. Well, we produce a lot of tools to talk about that. And also then the feminist assemblies started to talk about what kind of demand, what kind of claim we can do to be less in debt, to strike debt. And for example, if we have public policies of care, we won't be getting to debt to survive. So we started to try to connect this analysis of debt with concrete claims or demands, and also to produce this sort of political vocabulary.
Right. Okay, I see we have 5 minutes left, and I really wanted to talk about the backlash, which I think is something that is immediately visible to a lot of people in this room. Recently I was taking another look at Susan Faludi, the feminist writer, wrote this book, Backlash, in 1991, where she was talking about the backlash in the 70s and 80s against second wave feminism. And, so much of the book resonates today, but at the same time, she wrote an article within the last couple of years where she was, looking at the current backlash, comparing it to the past. And she made a point that I thought was really interesting, which is that she said that in the 70s and 80s, there was still people who were part of the backlash who were paying lip service, at least, to not being anti-woman, sort of sentimentalizing this idea of like real women and what real women really want. And whereas now what we see is just more nakedly misogynist. And so, I was thinking there have been several things recently that sort of struck me, aside from what's actually happening from positions of power. And Nesrine, in your book, you identify a couple of myths, and it's sort of interesting how they work together, which is one is the myth of gender equality among liberals, and at least how that idea sort of foundered on the reality of what happened in the last 7 or 8 years. And at the same time, there's this other myth, which is panic among conservatives about gender equality, and this idea that feminism has gone too far. And that reminded me of this really sort of stunning survey that the Southern Poverty Law Center conducted within the last couple of years of 1,500 Americans. And, they were the SPLC studies extremism, essentially. And so they presented survey respondents with reactionary statements to see how they would respond. And so perhaps not that surprisingly, most young Republicans agree with the statement, feminism has done more harm than good. But what was truly surprising to me was how many young Democrats agreed with that statement. These are Democrats. And especially for Democratic men under 50, according to their survey, 46% of them said this. And nearly a quarter of Democratic women also agreed with the statement. So I'm wondering what is going on here, Nesrine? Maybe.
Well, we have even less than 5 minutes now, so I don't know I'm going to cover all of that. So the concept of backlash is intimately connected to the concept of complacency. Backlash only comes when there is complacency. When I say complacency, what I mean is that lack of expanding the definition of rights from individual to group. The backlash has become layered now. So when I wrote those words about 6 years ago, it was in anticipation. It was just kind of the first wave, to coin a phrase, the first wave of backlash against Me Too, which was, okay, guys, we've fired the men. Maybe it's enough now. Maybe we stop going on about this. So the backlash has already begun in reaction to Me Too. And then there's been layers of backlash since. And now there is a backlash even from young women against the feminist movement. Because there is an understanding, and this is kind of different to the backlash from men, but there is an understanding that that has not translated into anything but more economic responsibility and individual responsibility, and less freedom to do what they would like to do, particularly with the limitations that having a female body or like having female biology, et cetera, and all, what that entails. So it has not resulted in reproductive scenarios that are favorable. It has not subsidized childcare. It has not closed the gender gap. It's not given you longer maternity leave. And all it has done is it has piled onto you or has afforded you the economic responsibilities and rights of men without the sort of freedoms to do what you would like to do. And there's this really interesting rise of the kind of fetishization of the soft life or the trad wife.
Oh, yeah.
Or the woman who is, having plenty of children, has a cast iron oven, takes care of her man, who's usually very wealthy, but that's not usually foregrounded. And attached to that, there is a backlash against work. There is a backlash against the fetishization of career as what is fulfilling. So these backlashes across the board in unexpected places amongst Democrats, amongst young Democrat men, amongst young women who have their whole lives ahead of them, is basically an unexpressed or unidentified or kind of sublimated recognition of the fact that the system has not produced the kind of scenarios that mean that the advancement of feminism does not feel threatening to men, because we exist in a society where it's a pie, and if someone gets more rights, then your rights will become less. So, and that's why I said we need more than 5 minutes. In that context, men will perceive the expansion of women's rights as a diminishment of theirs, because the value system has not been sort of buttressed from early on. And women who have eyes in their heads will see that it has diminishing returns for them as well. So the backlash might seem, and that's what I thought it was a few years ago, it might seem at first glance as a kind of patriarchy spitting out or rejecting women or the advancement of women. But it's a much bigger rejection. It's not just the patriarchy. It's not just men. It's an entire cohort of people who feel and register, maybe not quite articulate, that it's not delivering. This model is not delivering.
Just before we get into the Q&A, we started a little bit late. Do we have?
We have far? Sorry.
I was assuming we had a little more time. Let's just reclaim
There'll
our
be a
time.
backlash from the audience.
Thank you for that. I think that very helpfully links some of the sort of disparate thoughts I had in my mind about what was happening. Just before quickly we get, Veronica, did you want to add anything about, because you recently, or not you specifically, but Argentina recently elected, a very upfront anti-feminist man in Javier Milei.
Yes, we are experiencing that backlash in a very tragic way. I was thinking also this connection or disconnection between backlash and restoration, patriarchal restoration, that is also another term that is nowadays circulating to think about this kind of authoritarian regimes. But I think it's interesting to compare and contrast also the dynamics. And in Argentina, of course, Javier Milei is very obsessed with gender.
Yes.
In one of his first global scenarios at the Forum of Davos, the Economic Forum of Davos, he said that radical feminism is the enemy because it's social justice. So it is at the same time interesting how he, from the extreme far right, recognizes the feminist movement as a movement of social justice, because a lot of also left or leftist comrades, they do not recognize. Right. And they share this opinion that maybe you are going too fast and going, very quickly, and we have to be more patient with the social change. Right. So I think that it is an interesting paradox, how the ultra-right wing, as Javier Milei, is saying you are the enemy because you are the social justice movement. On the other hand, of course, he capitalized younger men vote. And it was very related to the feeling of frustration after the feminist movement. So nowadays, the the young voter says, I don't know how to, I should talk, I don't know how I should relate with other genders, and so on and so on. So he capitalized this kind of insecurity, this kind of, social and radical change in the sensibilities, in the popular sensibilities also. And it was very clear, for example, in the schools and in the universities that especially the young voters of Milei, they claim we want again to know what a man is. Mm-hmm. So it was very impressive also seeing that in very young people, for example, saying that we want to have a model. We have...
and Milei is their model.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
So I think this is part of our backlash, but at the same time, I want to be more with a little bit of hope. Yesterday in Argentina, it was a very, very massive, huge mobilization defending public universities and public schools, public education, and the protagonist of that mobilization was young people. So I think that we can do something about that and not let Milei completely win that
with his chains.
Yes, that battle.
Thank you for that. So let's get to this. We have some questions from students here, and I'll start with those. The first one is, how was the Me Too movement perceived internationally? So I don't know.
As a kind of curiosity, I think, from where I was standing. Internationally, I can't speak obviously for all the globe, but from where I stood in the Middle East and North Africa, it was seen as a sort of Hollywood phenomenon.
Yes.
It was definitely,
it
was definitely not seen, I mean, we could argue that it was, but it was definitely not seen as a sort of spasm of feminist revolution. It was seen as a kind of gossipy thing, or a tabloidy thing. And it was seen as, I remember people saying, do you know that famous actress? Apparently she was harassed. It was seen as a sort of curiosity of elite celebrity behavior, rather than a feminist phenomenon or something connected to feminist values. It definitely did not feel like the sort of revolutionary moment that it was, or that it felt like in the West. But it was also, I think, in a way, seen as a sort of frippery, seen as something quite trivial. And nobody, I remember people not quite understanding why it was such a big deal. And the only way they could understand why it was such a big deal is because celebrities were involved and high-profile people were involved. But what I found personally interesting was the kind of response to Me Too from the UK, where I was at the time, on the part of pundits, male pundits, columnists, and some female pundits as well, in panel shows and in columns. The resistance to Me Too, or the language of resistance to Me Too, felt so familiar because it sounded just like what Arabs and just what people in my family would say. When you talk about, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, when you talk about women getting in trouble by being harassed or groped, they're like, well, there's a place for women, and then when women get into the wrong places, then bad stuff happens. Men are sort of rocks that you stumble upon, as opposed to creatures with agency. So that I found really interesting, that the language of resistance to Me Too seemed like such a default setting in our societies, not even a male setting, just a default setting in our societies, wherever they were, from like, you know, the heartlands of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula to the studios of the BBC, the language was exactly the same. And I feel like it has evolved in a way, this kind of a separate conversation, but I feel that kind of anti-Me Too rhetoric about women's natural place and the kind of complementarity of women and how there's a system and there's a, you know, biology and things fit together in a certain way was seeded then and now has germinated and now has resulted in things like Andrew Tate, which is, you know, again, Andrew Tate just sounds like imam to me. Like there's a kind of or a specific kind of, not that I'm saying that imams share his politics. I think he would think imams are actually quite woke. But like that sort of the most extreme kind of religious rhetoric about gender. And I think that was seeded in that moment where the Me Too moment felt like such like a sexual question as opposed to a question about political rights. It was about like sexual safety and the sort of the dance of mating sexually. And I think that seeded a movement that I think has its echo in this backlash amongst, as you say, young Democrat men, which is that, okay, we can talk about financial rights, political rights, you know, the ability to work, the ability to get an education, but when you get into this bit, like you're messing with something really basic here. So maybe we need to keep that bit separate from the conversation.
Veronica, did you want to add, or should I?
Yes, in Argentina, I remember some comrades saying, but we were talking about that with other name, but it was not so famous.
Yeah.
Because there is other kinds of hashtag like I believe you or you can trust in me and these kind of things, but nothing was so spectacular as Me Too.
Right.
So these kind of differences, audience and famous thing, because it is here in the US. But at the same time, I think that is part of confirmation that we have to talk about sexual violence, but connected with political rights.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, we are still in the private idea of, well, this is a problem of interpersonal relations, and it's just a very simple idea of, male and women. So I think that in Argentina has this kind of effect. We were talking about that, but now it's famous. And we have to connect that with other strands of conversation, of struggles, because otherwise will be just, I think more a gossip thing than a political way of confronting more structural problematics.
Okay, our second question. How can women act as feminists and work with men as allies to tackle gender inequality?
God.
It's a big
I think
one.
you need like an entire course.
Seminar.
To cover this. I'll let Veronica start with that because she has more you've got more experience on the ground.
What kind of?
How can women act as feminists and work with men as allies to tackle gender inequality?
I'm not throwing it entirely to you. I'll answer it as well, but I thought I'd let you go first.
Well, I think that it's part of building coalitions in the spaces that you are develop your work and your life and your political struggles. I think, for example, in Argentina, the first feminist demonstrations were, you men, you should stay at home, taking care of kids, for example, and enable the feminist demonstration to be another kind of political image, because you are always on the front of all the political acts, for example. And nowadays, I think it's different because also we are dealing with another generation of men.
Right.
And I think this is very interesting. And this is what I saw in the picture yesterday in this huge demonstration. A lot of young men that are also socialize in other contexts and atmospheres, and they feel part of the feminist movement in a way that a previous generation never imagined, for example.
Right.
So I think that this is interesting to think not only in men, but this youth political activism that I think it is very much connected with feminism in other ways.
I think that one thing that is quite de-emphasized when people talk about how feminism can work with men is that men aren't just allies, they're also victims. That there is this tendency to separate men from the tithes and tolls of a society that subjugates women. Because it's difficult to think of a victim with no aggressor, right? Now, and the aggressor is a kind of diffuse value system, but it's not an individual man. It's not even a group of men. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a horrible finance term when there's like an obvious win that you have that you don't take. It's called leaving money on the table. Mm-hmm. And I think we leave money on the table when we frame feminism as a land grab for men or as an equalizing dynamic. One thing that I think is quite compelling, and a framing that is quite compelling, just in my experience, is that when there's a system that has these sort of feminist inadequacies, men are actually picking up the slack otherwise. So men don't have enough paternity leave, right? Men don't have the ability to ventilate and talk about their feelings and emotions because that is the preserve of women. Men are burdened with huge economic responsibilities that mean that their freedom to choose their careers, their livings, their way their lives look is severely circumscribed because women cannot share the economic burden because they are also limited by the kind of state lack of subsidy for their, childcare, etc. So it's an interlocking system of rights. It looks like men have the better deal, and they broadly do. I'm not saying that they don't. But it's also, there's also tithes on them that are not framed as feminist tithes. They're not framed as the result of inadequate rights for women. And there's I remember during the Arab Spring, there was this huge fetishization of women's role in the Arab Spring, which always happens. Whenever there's a revolution in the Muslim world, the Arab world, everyone's like, women are at the front of the revolution. I'm like, they're there, they exist. It doesn't mean, the fact that they're there doesn't mean that they have suddenly, that the revolution has suddenly become a feminist one. And there was a kind of overemphasis on the Arab Spring or political revolutions in the Middle East being revolutions that were going to upturn a system that uniquely victimized women. And I remember kind of falling into this trap one time in a discussion with an Egyptian professor. And she said to me, "You're talking a lot about women," she said, "in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt and, Bahrain, etc., where all of these protests were happening." And she said, "Sure, women in Saudi Arabia can't drive, but men can't vote, Women in Egypt don't have divorce rights, but men are sodomized in prison when they're arrested without warrant." So it was just this very graphic confrontation of the fact that this is a system that universally, but uniquely subjugates men and women. So the answer to my attempt at an answer to your question is, allyship in itself is kind of the wrong framing, or the sort of, it's not the angle in, I think, to convert men to this cause and move together. It's to portray it as a partnership, like where this is your problem as well. People don't tell you that it's your problem because of this, but it is your problem because of this.
Mm. I want to add something that I remember a quote of a feminist anthropologist in Argentina, Rita Segato, and she talks about how to dismantle the mandate of masculinity. And she analyzed that in order to think how the femicide, for example, is a sort of code of communication between men more than a direct message to women. So I think that debate was very important, for example, to think in this kind of what forms of masculinity are mandatory.
Yeah.
And how we can dismantle that, producing other kind of sensibilities, relationships, but also going beyond the idea of victim and victim.
Exactly, and that's exactly what I was about to say, which is to think about who is a victim, what is a victim, what defines a victim. It's going back to a point I made at the earlier part of this discussion about spaces that are considered sort of dark and airless. My abiding memory of growing up in what was an incredibly basic conservative society in sub-Saharan Africa is that there was a huge amount of comfort amongst the sort of women. You know, it felt like a very rich, very safe space. It not even related to one's education, where there was a very sophisticated level of support and understanding. And my memory of the kind of male space, because it was quite segregated, is that it was cold and airless and jagged. And it seemed there was kind of these lost, wounded creatures that could function but couldn't quite find some solace. And I think that defining pain, defining suffering, defining victimization in ways that go beyond the sort of infrastructural descriptions of like who struggles under the patriarchy is a good place to start.
So our last student question, and I'd also like to get to some of the questions from the audience. I feel like this question is really directed at you, Veronica, which is what strategies can feminist student organizations employ to engage with international feminist movements? And actually there's one more student question in addition to that, so there's 4.
Well, I think, for example, in Argentina, the universities are very active space to do feminist politics in terms of claiming, other contents and curricula, but also other distribution of work, but also other forms of occupying the streets with the feminist movement. With a commitment of the universities more deep. And nowadays, I think what is happening here in US with the campus against the genocide and how this struggle could be also part of feminist struggle, I think this is an urgent question. Because since we witness, for example, how the universities in Gaza was bombed, I think that all have the question, we have the question, what does it mean to inhabit a university? And for example, yesterday for me, it was very moving, this demonstration in Argentina, because I think that nowadays the universities are being sort of battleground, because all those right-wing leaders also are very anti-intellectuals. Although, for example, Milei, he wants to be an intellectual.
Oh, really?
Yes, but they are very anti-intellectual, and I think they reject something that for me is at the core of the feminist movement, that is a sort of desire for theory. Not in an abstract or academic sense. I think that when we are disputing narratives, when we produce different publications and we debate in the internet, but also other things, we are all the time disputing concepts. And it's not, I think, by nothing that the so-called gender ideology pretends to produce a sort of battle in terms of concepts, ideology, and thought. So I think that universities are very fruitful spaces to produce concepts, tools of struggles, and also to think how to mobilize people and how to dispute the narratives that we want to share and to produce as also part of the struggle.
No, I'm good. I'm not going to try and gild the lily. That was great.
And this is actually connected, I think, to that question. In what ways can university curricula integrate global feminist issues to better educate students about gender inequality?
So this kind of comes back to a couple of the answers I gave earlier. It's not just in incorporating different challenges globally for feminism, but incorporating different models of freedom, right? Different models of rights, different models of what defines freedom, and different models of how actually, this has been a kind of consistent theme of the past 3 days, how to coexist with things that you don't quite understand, or that don't quite make sense to you, or don't quite look like the linear model of freedom that you are very attached to. I think is a very expansive and healthy place to start. It is always kind of a challenge to try and explain to people who have very earnest concerns about, the state of women elsewhere, that the advancement of women's rights in other places don't necessarily have to follow the same linear sort of path that you have been taught or that you would like to see for it to be not only valid, but also informing of your experience and inspiriting to you somehow and expansive to you somehow. And I, because of my background and because of the sort of polarity of living in societies that have no individual rights, but lots of communal rights, and living in societies that have the opposite, is to kind of think in terms, when you incorporate these models or challenges, think in terms of not only rights, but freedom to use those rights, right? That you can have plenty of rights, but your ability to exercise them is quite limited. And you can have very few rights, but your ability to indulge or engage in communal support and comfort that is the state, outside the auspices of the state, is actually quite big. And that can give you a lot of autonomy in ways that are they're not necessarily intuitive. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is just to see, when you do incorporate these ideas of global feminism challenges or models, is to see them as in their totality. So not just how women exist in that society, but how the entire political and social model informs that mode of feminist travel or challenge, and how it is often the case that those societies are held back by their similar inability to see feminism as a group benefit. There's a very good book written by an author called Jonathan Metzl called Dying of Whiteness, which is about how in America white people have been sold policies that hurt them the most because they have been packaged in a way that suggests that if you give minorities these, if you expand rights to minorities, this will take away from the benefits of whiteness, which means that white people end up voting for regimes that are always not in their favor. So, continuing the privatization of health, not voting for gun legislation, things like that. And it's been a very helpful framing for me, because I think there is such a thing as sort of dying of maleness, right? Dying by constantly thinking that things that are in your benefit, because they exclude someone else from your immediate sphere of influence and power, are therefore good for you. And so I now think of the lack of women's rights, or the sort of the challenge of women's rights in countries that I am from or that I am close to, as challenges for everyone, and that hurt everyone when they're not addressed in that kind of total universal way.
So I see we have 5 minutes left. So I'm not sure if we're going to be able to go.
There's just a question from the back there.
Oh,
Sorry.
oh, there's. Oh, I have questions,
There's questions
here that I should get to first.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. In the context of global feminism, how do you see the development of tensions between universal human rights and a cultural relativist approach to feminism evolving?
It's interesting because when I started to talk, I referred to the experience of mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, and they developed a praxis of human rights that is not universal, it's not liberal. It's very grounded to a very concrete experience. And I think that in Argentina, this is a very important tradition to confront with more NGOs speeches about human rights, for example. And at the same time, I think that when we talk about global feminism, it's almost a very huge idea, and what for me is a challenge in the feminist movement that I part of is how we can produce at the same time transnational networks, transnational slogans, transnational translations, and at the same time from a very grounded experience, and how this other level of transnational or global, or it is not a sort of abstraction or detachment of your grounded experience, because otherwise it's like two different levels, and one is the universal level and the other one remains the particular level. So how, but in the last year, I think it is very interesting, the politics of translation of the feminist movement. Maybe you know this chant from the Chilean collective Las Tesis against machista violence, and how this chant was translated and reinterpreted in different countries, and at the same time how you articulate with different debates about what is the experience of freedom, of rights, and it is not a sort of new way of putting all the slogan together to produce a coherent text of global feminism. So I think this is a very crucial challenge.
Oh yes, yes, that's right.
I think that there's some, there's almost a level or a degree before that, which is there's some very basic, obvious ways in which global feminism can be forged. And what has been very unnerving is how over the past 6 months we have seen in Gaza a war that has disproportionately affected women and disproportionately affected young girls as well, like not having access to period products, not having access to shelter, hygiene, women who are postnatal, not having access to, the most basic equipment, cesareans under anesthetic. Like, it cannot get more on the sharp end of what women should feel, immediately connected to, across the kind of age range as well. You can sympathize with like a 12-year-old girl who cannot get sanitary products. And what has been so unnerving is how what is an obvious connection, what is a really clear and obvious visceral connection, has had very little traction compared to the very heavily wielded, propagandized approach towards women in Afghanistan, for example, which recruited at the time the wife of the British Prime Minister and the wife of the American president. Because that was a political narrative that was very clear and about kind of domination and about incorporation into a sort of Western hegemonic program. But this is something that cannot be threaded into that. So I think a very simple early place to start is to just remove yourself from these kind of political framings, and just see other women outside the media narrative or the political narrative that you've been used to, or even the kind of framing of women who are unfamiliar to you, or maybe don't share your values, or maybe would not even like you very much, or be hostile to you because they come from a different, antagonistic place, does not mean that you shouldn't feel that sense of solidarity and support for them. So I think there is a risk sometimes that we think of global solidarities or the kind of these, the abstractions of feminism and the practicalities of feminism, the things that are kind of very difficult to join, and that there's a natural cleavage between them. But I think that is a function of the kind of excessive narrativization and framing of what other women deserve, should have access to, and how different they are to us. So I think that is something that we can very easily bridge just by making those connections ourselves.
Well, thank you for that. I think that's a hopeful note to end on. And I want to thank Veronica and Nesreen for being such wonderful discussants.
And you for being such a wonderful moderator. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody who came out to listen to this dialogue today. Thank you so much.